All right. Good evening. We will get started. So, welcome to Buddhism in a Nutshell. My name is Dondrub, and this is our first class of the series. We will continue on Fridays at this time through March. And this class, Buddhism in a Nutshell, is kind of the companion class to what's happening next month, which is called Meditation 101. These two classes, and there's now actually a third class within FPMT's curriculum. Those two are kind of the two introductory level classes. There's now a class called Introduction to Mindfulness, which we also offer here at the center. So, and Friday nights is sort of our introductory day of the week. So we will cycle through these three classes month after month after month. But historically speaking, those two classes, Buddhism in a Nutshell, Meditation 101, they were the broad level overview of Buddhism for FPMT. And now Introduction to Mindfulness goes in a little bit more detail on specifically mindfulness, the aspect of mindfulness and mindfulness meditation as well. So this class, it's focused on really the philosophical side of Buddhism. And then the next class, Meditation 101, as you might expect, is focused on the meditation side of things. So we won't do much in the way of meditating this month. That will be what we do next month. We've got a morning meditation at 7 a.m. Mountain Time, that 7 to 7:30 on Zoom. So if you're interested in guided meditations, we have that. We also have a Vajrasattva practice at 9 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday as well, also on Zoom. Vajrasattva is more, kind of particularly Buddhist, whereas the morning meditation is broader. The topics are not. Some of them are somewhat more particularly Buddhist, others are more general. All right. So our center is from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and particularly within that, the Gelug presentation of Tibetan Buddhism. So that is the lineage that we will be presenting information from within all of our classes. And of course, that will be true for this one as well. We'll talk a little bit about the kind of general Buddhist worldview, in the sense of the different ways in which it's practiced, how Buddhism is understood and practiced in different ways in different countries. We'll look at that a little bit, but generally speaking, from our center, the way that we present the information is coming from that particular lineage. In today's class, we will start, if you really just with the word Buddhism, right? It refers to the Buddha. It refers to what was given to us by mainly one particular historical figure. And so we'll start by looking at the life of the Buddha and what, how he came to be known as this incredible teacher. So that's what we will focus on today. So if if today doesn't seem like we've gotten to the meat of the course, that's true. We're kind of setting the stage in the first class, and then the remainder of the classes will be where we really start to flesh out the philosophical side of things in more detail. So, the Buddha, the person who would become the Buddha, because Buddha is a title, it means the one who is awake. And so the Buddha was born as Siddhartha Gautama, and only after showed the aspect of awakening did he take on the title of Buddha. Uh, Siddhartha was born in a town called Lumbini, which is in present-day Nepal. This was 2,600 years ago. So, the borders most likely were different than they are now. Back then, the sort of Indian subcontinent, this area, was really a collection of what you might call city states, kind of these relatively modest fiefdoms. Kingdoms is a word that maybe is used, but when you hear the word kingdom in this context, it isn't like a grand sort of continent spanning idea that we associate with vast tracts of land, and they're really much more modest city states. And that's relevant because his parents were known, again, in English, we would say a king and queen, but again, very much more modest than we might imagine from the European dynasties and things. So that did make Siddhartha a prince, meaning that he could take over, again, one of these relatively modest city states when the time was right. It was still a familial process of transmitting ownership. So that is what would have been expected for his life when the time came to do that. And Lumbini is, again, like I said, right across the border, uh, almost on the border between present-day India and present-day Nepal. So that's kind of relevant in the sense that we know that all of his teachings, when he became the Buddha, they really all happened in present-day India, which is why the Buddha is associated with India very closely now. It just happened that he traveled to what became India, and all of the towns and places that he gave teachings ended up being in present-day India rather than present-day Nepal. So, as I mentioned, his father was the king. His mother died shortly after giving birth to Siddhartha. So he was raised by his father. And what happened, what they say happened, the story goes, shortly after Siddhartha was born, his father took him to, you could say, a spiritual seer, someone who was known to have some clairvoyant capacity, someone who a person would go, that people would go to receive readings, or maybe you could say prophecies about the future. And this person foresaw that Siddhartha's life could take one of two directions. Either Siddhartha could follow in the footsteps of his family and become the king of this area. And if that were to happen, it was told to his father that Siddhartha would be successful in uniting these city-states, these smaller areas or kingdoms, into a very impressive sort of unified geopolitical power. Or it was said that Siddhartha might reject that particular path for his life. And if that happened, it was said that Siddhartha would grow up to still unite all of these peoples and areas, but to do it with a shared philosophical view, a shared religious or philosophical view, you could say. Um, and so his father knew that. That's what his father was told by this seer. And his father didn't have any interest in that philosophical, spiritual, religious idea. He very much wanted Siddhartha to take over as the head of, and he was very excited about this idea that Siddhartha might become a great ruler of all of these lands. So his father's idea about how to kind of make that happen was to prevent Siddhartha from learning very much about the world, from learning about the religious traditions that were there, from learning a lot about the human experience, and getting a sense of the way things were. He felt perhaps if Siddhartha could be isolated from the world and could be sheltered from the world, then he could be groomed to take over in the way that his father wanted. So that's what his father did. But that only worked up until roughly Siddhartha's late 20s. At that point, he became sort of overwhelmingly curious about the outside world. So he travels to the local village and just for a day outing. And when he does that, he has a really transformative experience in coming across what are known as the four sights, SIGHTS, not like SITES, but sights, the four things that he observed. So those four sights were a sick person, uh, a dead person, or a dead body, and a wandering mendicant, and a very, very old person. So he was exposed to, you could say, sickness, aging, and death, as well as a view toward a religious life. Because in India, in what is present day India at the time, 2600 years ago, there were many rich religious traditions, and it was quite common for people to go, to do what was called going forth into homelessness, which is what becoming a Buddhist monastic is still referred to as. They would wander. They would basically just renounce society and family and jobs, and they would just sort of wander and meditate and try to uncover the meaning of life, the nature of the self, and so on. So he saw someone who was engaged in that kind of effort, a mendicant, a wandering spiritual practitioner. And like I say, he was exposed to great sickness, great aging, the effects, the tremendous effects of old age on the body. And he saw a funeral procession through the streets with a corpse. And it's said that this was the first time that Siddhartha had really thought about the effects of sickness, aging, and death, because he himself, as I said, was in his mid to late 20s, still very vital, very healthful, and he had been isolated from society. So his father had made great pains to protect him from seeing suffering kind of in the world. And so he realized in his late 20s, that by quizzing the servants that, came with him into town, is this unusual? I'm seeing someone whose body is extremely weak, extremely frail. I'm seeing someone who maybe has boils on their body or has a racking cough. And I'm seeing, a lifeless corpse in the street. Is that, how typical are these things? What is this? It's just some sort of bizarre aberration. And these servants who lived in the town and were not isolated, they said, no, this is what every person can look forward to. If you live long enough, you will experience the ravages of extreme old age. You will experience debilitating, extreme illness, and you will end up as a corpse. So Siddhartha realized at quite a late age, for the first time, that that was his existential condition, and it was the existential condition of everyone that he knew, everyone that he loved. Um, and that was a really shocking wake-up call for him, having been so isolated and having been so protected. We've all had similar experiences when a pet dies, people that we know die. We've been to funerals at relatively young ages, and we were kind of led by our family, our friends, to understanding that in increasingly sophisticated ways over our lives, so that it wasn't quite such a shock for us. We do understand that that's the condition that sentient beings, humans, face. But much more of a shock when that's what happens for the first time at a later age. So he became, because of this, really motivated to do something, to try to find a solution to this existential condition of suffering, of sickness, aging, and death. So he decided at that moment to follow in the footsteps of this wandering mendicant, to renounce his titles, renounce his land, to go forth into homelessness, and to try to seek the answers to, again, the meaning of life. And is there something that can be done? Is there a solution to the suffering that we all face? So that's what he immediately did. He, for the next about 7 years after going forth, he became a student of the religious traditions that were common at the time. And the prevailing view in India, Nepal at the time, spiritually, religiously, was related to asceticism. So these practitioners would go for long periods without food, without water. They would stand in cold, rushing water. They would, do these really harsh ascetic practices. The theory, as I understand it, being perhaps that if you punish the body sufficiently, then maybe the mind can transcend the flesh, that the mind can be kind of liberated from the body through these punishing acts. And he engaged in that because, that was the view, the prevailing view, that doing that was really helpful for gaining meditative absorptions, for being able to transcend the bounds of the flesh. But he he wasn't really that successful during this time. And there came a point where he was trying to meditate by a river bank toward the end of this 7-year period. And At this time, you'll find statues, not really so much in the Tibetan tradition, but in the Theravadan tradition, Thai, different other traditions, you'll find statues of what's called the starving Buddha. And it doesn't actually refer to the Buddha past the point where he showed the aspect of achieving enlightenment. It actually shows him at this time where he's um, kind of about to orient himself toward his enlightenment, or toward what will lead him to showing the aspect of enlightenment. Because at this time, he was really quite near death. He was engaging in these incredibly austere practices and got to the point where his death was near. And he sees a musician on a raft on this river coming toward him. And the musician is playing some sort of stringed instrument. I don't know specifically what, but a stringed instrument of some sort. And Siddhartha is hearing this really beautiful music that the musician is producing. And for Siddhartha, that served as an insight into how the musician was able to produce such beautiful music. And his insight was that the strings of the instrument were tuned kind of right in the middle. If the strings were very, very tight, then the sound would be very harsh. If the strings were very loose, then there'd be no sound. It would, you wouldn't be successful in producing anything. So Siddhartha had this insight that he had gone too far, that his austere ascetic practices were really interfering with his ability to meditate, his ability to study, and so on. And this is one way of thinking about the middle way philosophy. It's not the only way that the phrase middle way philosophy is used, but one of the ways refers to the extremes of either hedonism or austerity, and how the Buddha taught that we really need to avoid moving into either extreme. We need to make time for our practice by being mindful of how much time we might be spending doing entertainment and kind of silly things that don't really serve much purpose. But we also need to be mindful of not punishing the body, not going without sleep, going without food, being too extreme in our practice. So one way of thinking about the middle way is finding a balance where we're sleeping enough, we're nourishing the body, we're doing all of the things that we need to do, and also we're mindful about not wasting inordinate amounts of time, with, kind of less meaningful activities. So this resulted in Siddhartha beginning to take food again, to really do what he needed to do to nourish his body. So after this, during this period, he travels to Bodh Gaya in India, which is in Bihar state, in present-day India. And he sat beneath a tree called the Bodhi tree, and decided that that would be the place of his awakening, that he would not arise from meditation until he had achieved full awakening. And so he remained there and continued to meditate. And he, there came a point where the word Mara comes up at this point in the sutras, and Mara comes up throughout the sutras, meaning different things. Sometimes it refers to the outer Mara, which shows up in the sutras as like the personification of kind of doubt and, uh, in a way, all of the the hindrances to spirituality, to spiritual practice. It's presented, I mean, if you take it at face value, it's kind of presented as a spirit, as a being who kind of enjoys harassing spiritual practitioners and kind of raising doubt and causing them to maybe move away from their practice. But so whether or not there are beings that are like that, there could be, there could be actual spirit beings who kind of enjoy that kind of thing, and maybe that's to some degree what was happening. But really, you could also think about Mara as the parts of our own mind that move us away from our practice, the parts of our own mind that where we want to just be comfortable. We want to, you know, just think about having status and having a good reputation and, being comfortable and sort of just getting through things and enjoying things, and maybe not, we're not sure, should we really put time and energy and effort into practice? And well, we can't go on this vacation because we maybe would think about doing retreat, and kind of this mind that we have that makes it an obstacle to really engage in serious practice. That's sort of the inner Mara. Um, in either way, um, these doubts and these um, afflictions strongly arose on the final night of Siddhartha's meditation, but he was able to overcome sensual desire, again, this craving for comfort and, all of these things, and his tendency toward hatred and, kind of all of these afflicted states. He was able to subdue them in his meditation, and then he arose as the Buddha. He arose having achieved his enlightenment. uh, and then they say that he remained in meditation after that for about 7 more weeks. After having achieved enlightenment, he remained in meditation, really having accomplished something that was so profound and so difficult. Um, he wasn't sure um, what, you know, whether he should try to teach, whether it would be possible for other people to follow in his footsteps. Um, but um, so, he had these questions about whether it would be possible to share his experience with others. But he did travel. He arose from that and kind of started to travel again. And he came across people that he had previously uh, meditated with when he was an ascetic practitioner, and they had initially been really harsh in rejecting him when he decided to eat and decided to, take care of himself. But now, having arose after having showed the aspect of achieving enlightenment, they became his disciples. They requested him to teach. They requested to become his first disciples, even though they had previously rejected him for turning away from the ascetic path. So this was when, now having been requested, he saw that there were people who were ripe, who could be led to achieve what he achieved. So he would then spend the rest of his life giving those teachings and explaining essentially everything that he would go on to teach would be just explaining what his own experience was, how he himself achieved enlightenment and what he saw to be true. Uh, so that's what we have. We now have this compendium of knowledge coming from the Buddha, um, which explains, if you want to, how do you replicate the insights that the Buddha had, because that's the only difference between us as ordinary sentient beings and a fully awakened being, is that the fully awakened being has already had those insights. They've already done the work that leads to those insights. And we're just starting on that path, or maybe we're just thinking about even if we're interested in starting on that path. But there's no fundamental distinction between a fully awakened being and an ordinary sentient being. It's just two different points on the same path of training, the same path of insight, realization. Like, it's like saying a person on the first day of medical school is really the same as a person who's a doctor. It's just that the doctor already did the medical school, and the person on their first day, they haven't learned everything. They haven't done all of the things that you do. But if they put in the time, they put in the effort, they engage in all of those practices, they will get that same result. They will also achieve that state. Um, and the difference, too, is that it's probably not as difficult, really. I mean, it's more difficult in the sense that it probably takes more than one lifetime, but it's less difficult in the sense that studying Buddhism, meditating on it, intellectually speaking, you don't have to understand the functioning of mitochondria and all kinds of crazy things. It's relatively all straightforward, but it will probably, it may take more than one lifetime. So difficult in some ways, less difficult in other ways. But at least when we're doing it, it's probably much more joyous than I would imagine, than it is to not sleep and be on call and do all of the crazy things that you have to do to be a surgeon or something. So like that. So let me pause for any reflections or questions that have arisen so far. Kim, are you trying to unmute? Yep, I think so.
I am, Venerable. Thank you. I've read this story many times, and I don't know, and maybe it's not important.
Sorry, there might be a problem. Sometimes with this, the microphone interferes. I think you might be unmuted, but I can't hear you, and I apologize. Sometimes it happens on this. So you might need to put your question in the chat.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Shall do.
This external microphone messes with how this sounds. Or maybe it could just be because... Nope. That's not why. Sorry, you might be, if you're on your phone, that might be.
I am.
If you're on your phone, it might be difficult to use the chat. I'm sorry. If you can get it figured out, I will see it in the chat and I will circle back to you. And I'll give you my email address. You can email me if you can't. We'll talk about it. Any other? Oh, good. How did the Buddha know he was fully enlightened is the question. So I've never really heard of an extremely clear-cut way of understanding that. Maybe if somebody else has been given the absolutely clear-cut, because it is true that if you historically there are people who have been mistaken. You find people who've achieved really high states of meditative absorption, and it's so different than being an ordinary sentient being. They thought, oh, well, this is enlightenment. And it's not. So it does seem like a pitfall from a meditator's standpoint. It's been presented as something that people can misunderstand, which is why it's really helpful to have a teacher. The Buddha didn't have a teacher
Right.
in that lifetime. So in a way, it depends upon what explanation of the Buddha's enlightenment you accept. The Tibetan Buddhist view is that at this time, the Buddha only showed the aspect of achieving enlightenment, that the Buddha's enlightenment had actually occurred previously to even his birth in that life. And so the Buddha's mind was fully enlightened from the moment of his birth, at the first moment of his birth up through when he showed the aspect of achieving enlightenment. Not all Buddhist traditions globally take that view. Some of them do take the view that he did achieve enlightenment at that moment and was an ordinary sentient being prior to that. Certainly, it is the case that he was an ordinary sentient being at some point, and achieved enlightenment at some point, but it's debated, when specifically, or thought of differently in different traditions in terms of when specifically that happened. So the question is then, how does anyone who achieves enlightenment know that they've now achieved enlightenment? And that is like I said, there's not a real clear, incontrovertible way of truly knowing that's like explainable in words or given to people as like, here, this is the benchmark. But the definition of a fully enlightened being is a being who has completely eliminated even the slightest trace of any conceivable state of affliction, meaning that they cannot give rise to any type of hatred, even going down, because all of these states are on a spectrum. So if you look at hatred, like the extreme of hatred is wanting to kill, like being motivated to murder someone. But the very, very light version of that is like being frustrated, like just being annoyed. It's on the same spectrum. It's like, I'm not, um, it's a continuous sort of thing where you're like, you're feeling agitated towards someone, you're feeling kind of hot, averse towards someone because they're chewing their food too loudly, or they're, clicking their pen, and you're like, could you please stop that? That's still on the same spectrum. It's a very, very light version. But so for an enlightened being, there's no trace of any of those afflicted states. And their mind is the embodiment of perfect love, perfect generosity, perfect compassion, perfect equanimity. And they have certain capacities. An enlightened being, their mind isn't limited to their own body. They can create manifestations or emanations of their mind. So if you, at a certain point, can start doing that. Now, even with that, it's more complicated because there's different levels of the bodhisattva grounds and paths, and emanation is not unique to full enlightenment. It just, your capacity grows in emanating. So again, it's not a totally clear-cut thing. You could be on the bodhisattva grounds and paths. So, but you also, you become able to, but again, like these other cities, these other states, like clairvoyance, clairaudience, they're also shared with beings on the bodhisattva grounds and paths. So they also aren't unique. The only thing that's really particularly unique about an enlightened being as opposed to a high level bodhisattva is that a fully enlightened being is able to observe the ultimate nature of reality concurrently with the ultimate nature, with the conventional nature of reality. So in waking life, in conscious experience, conventional and ultimate reality appear to a fully awakened being simultaneously, and a high level bodhisattva can only perceive ultimate reality in meditative equipoise, which I realize probably isn't very helpful. But but a person could probably be mistaken. Like, am I truly perceiving ultimate reality or not? That's also something that you have to. So it could be just one of those things that it does become clear subjectively speaking,
Mm,
um, but it's so difficult to explain. There isn't a way of like providing a written
mm.
test, like a written
Yeah.
description that we get to use.
Mhm.
But like I say, historically people make mistakes because they achieve like the peak of samsara, which is just a meditative formless absorption, and they kind of think, oh well, this must be it.
Yeah.
So it is a pitfall from a meditative standpoint. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions?
Can you actually hear me? Or
Yes, Jonathan. And again, I'm sorry, you'll probably have to use the chat. Um, oh, I had a question about the removal process. I can perhaps try to ask it via voice. Yeah, no, I think it's when I plug in my external microphone to this Chromebook, it hijacks the speakers in a weird way, but maybe I can try to see if it's a setting. Because because it says same as system is yeah. On the Chromebook, it's not like a real Zoom app. It's a weird, like truncated Zoom app. So this just happens sometimes. I'm sorry. Okay. But yeah, we're gonna get this feedback. So yeah, that's the problem with having more than one Zoom in a room. Okay. So Jonathan's gonna work on his question. Is it correct? I want to say fourth.
No.
They talk about, and I don't know because when they say, yeah, they talk about different. Because here they mean when they say in this sense, I can't remember if it's the third or the fourth. But yes, historically, there's Kashapya, there's other wheel turning Buddhas that you find in the sutras. So this, in that sense, and with regard to that question, it's referring to specifically wheel turning Buddhas, which is different than just, oh, I'm a person who achieved enlightenment. If a person achieves enlightenment, then they're also a Buddha. They've achieved enlightenment. But a wheel turning Buddha is a specific kind of karmic appearance of a Buddha. They have a specific karmic connection to a world system, and they manifest in the world to show the deeds of a Buddha and to create Buddhism, or to create a philosophical system in that world system. And the Buddha, the historical Buddha, was a wheel turning Buddha, meaning he created the system of achieving enlightenment in a world system. And he was not, he was, like I said, the third or fourth, something like that, wheel turning Buddha. So that's what it means in terms of that. But anyone can achieve enlightenment, and then they are validly also a Buddha. They just might not be a wheel turning Buddha, someone who manifests in that particular way. But there's no difference in terms of their mind, in terms of, what they've accomplished. They just don't have that particular karmic appearance as a wheel turning Buddha. Anything else? Okay. So so if at any time a person has a question, just go ahead and put it in the chat, and then that won't be disruptive, and I'll just see it and I will address it. Okay. So I mentioned that the Buddha gave his first teaching to those five people who had previously been his kind of compatriots, and then they became his disciples. And his first teaching was on what's called the Four Noble Truths. That was given in Sarnath, or also called Deer Park, where he began to turn the wheel of Dharma by giving the teaching on the Four Noble Truths. And things get complicated here, right off the bat, because with the word noble, to us in English, and what we're going to see is that there are many examples of a Sanskrit word or a Tibetan word, because in our tradition, the sutras were preserved in what's called the Sanskrit canon, and then they were translated into Tibetan, and then they're coming to us. For us, if we can't read Tibetan or we can't read Sanskrit, we're limited to what's been published in English. So we have the first problem of the Tibetan scholars needing to figure out how to translate Sanskrit into Tibetan, and now the second problem of English scholars trying to figure out how to translate Tibetan into English. So it's pretty complicated, and there are some shortcomings of that whole process, like the word noble, because for us, when we think of the word noble, we think of, something that is noble or has nobility. And that's not what's meant by the word noble. The word noble is an English, someone picking an English word that refers to the word Arya. But Arya is a very specific kind of technical word, and it refers to a meditative realization in the mind of that person. A person becomes an Arya being. They were an ordinary being, and now they're an Arya being. And they do this by having what's called a direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. Which is a phrase that I'm going to stick with because it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any baggage with it. It doesn't imply anything. So I'm going to stick with it until the fifth class, when we will look at this concept in a bit more detail. But ultimately, it's the point of Buddhist practice is to have a direct, non-conceptual, meditative realization of the nature of reality, the ultimate nature of reality. When a person does that, immediately, initially, they become an Arya being. They then have to repeat that realization many more times. And from the Tibetan perspective, they have to join that with bodhicitta motivation, the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings without exception. Um, Combining those two things is what creates the causes and conditions to become a fully awakened being or a Buddha. So an Arya being is not a Buddha. The Arya path is the goal of the Theravada tradition, the way that Buddhism is packaged in the Southeast Asian countries, primarily countries like Thailand and Cambodia, Laos, different parts of Southeast Asia. The northern Asian countries like China, Japan, Tibet, these are what are called the Mahayana tradition countries. In the southern countries, they follow, it's all the same thing, but there's the Pali canon and then the Sanskrit canon. Uh, the Pali canon is what they follow in the Southeast Asian traditions. The teachings that ended up being written down after hundreds of years of Buddhism being an oral tradition, the teachings were written down either in Pali or in Sanskrit. The Sanskrit canon is what was adopted in the northern Asian countries, the Pali canon in the southern Asian countries. In the northern Asian countries, the Pali canon is subsumed into practice, but then there are additional sutras and tantras that only exist in the Sanskrit canon. So there's an additional layer of practice that you find in the Mahayana tradition that's absent from, broadly speaking, absent from the Pali tradition or the Theravada tradition. Sometimes also, you may come across Hinayana as another way of talking about the Theravada tradition. It's kind of not considered to be the most polite way of referring to the Theravada tradition because it literally means lesser vehicle, whereas Mahayana means greater vehicle. And if you're in the Theravada tradition, you prefer not to be referred to as a practitioner of the lesser, vehicle. Um, His Holiness the Dalai Lama uses individual vehicle versus universal vehicle as another way of talking about that. But Theravada means tradition of the elders. So again, if you practice in that tradition, that's much nicer to be, I'm a practitioner of the elder tradition, whereas the lesser vehicle is not so nice. But the difference is that the Arya path, which was a valid path taught by the Buddha, results in lower nirvana, whereas the Mahayana tradition teaches the path that leads to full awakening. Both paths taught by the Buddha, but they have a different result in what they lead a practitioner to. So an Arya being, a person might stop on the Arya path and achieve individual nirvana, lower nirvana, um, or they might become an Arya Bodhisattva. They might have this direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality, but join it with realization of bodhicitta, and they become an Arya Bodhisattva. So you either become an Arhat, or you become an Arya Bodhisattva, which leads you to full enlightenment. Um, Okay, and so Jonathan's question is, as he said, quite detailed, and it's in the chat now. So I will look at it and So the question is kind of maybe the role of energetic transmission between a student and their teacher, and what role that plays. The idea of so transmission can have different meanings, of course. In one way, we can refer to transmission as kind of the valid, sort of generation to generation transmission of a valid way of understanding the teachings, a valid way of practicing, meaning that it's traceable back to the Buddha, meaning that it has a valid lineage, and it's not something that the person is making up. It's it's an actual transmission of real wisdom that comes from a valid, unbroken lineage. It can also be energetic, though, too, in the sense like there's something about being in the room with your teacher, that there's a deeper energetic level to what's going on. It isn't just that they're transmitting the words or they're transmitting um, the concepts or the way in which something is done, but they're actually, you're kind of in their energy field in a way. And when you're in that energy field, there's kind of a mind to mind relationship. And that's definitely something that is understood in Tibetan Buddhism, and is certainly, it's I would still say it's an important. I think it's one of those things that's also difficult to put into words. Um, the Buddha, of course, I mean, if you look at the sutra material, the Buddha is very clear that enlightened beings cannot just flip a switch in our minds. If they could do that, then they would have done that, right? If it was possible for them to just send forth blessing energy into all reality, and then all sentient beings are now enlightened beings, they would have done that already. And we'd all just be enlightened beings. So it's, the Buddha himself said that the Buddhas, all of the enlightened beings, they do not have the power to wash away our negative karma like you wash your clothes. The Buddha said all the Buddhas can do is point to the truth, point the way, show us what we ourselves have to do. So no one can meditate for us, no one can study for us, no one can help us to develop concentration. No one can make us act ethically and so on. We have to come to see the value of these things and do what's necessary to get those results. But it is true that in Tibetan Buddhism, they do make room for the idea that, like with empowerments, that you find it more in what's called the Vajrayana tradition in Buddhism, the tantric tradition. You find it more emphasized in that tradition than on the sutra path. And this class will deal 99% with the sutra path. But particularly in Vajrayana, you find a real appreciation of that energetic aspect between a student and their teacher, and the role that does play. But still, the overwhelming majority of what is done is something that we do ourselves. Yeah, that certainly the enlightened beings, they can, and that's part of the reason that we make prayers to enlightened beings, and requests, and we kind of draw ourselves closer to that energy, because it is understood that that they can help to activate positive karma in our mind, They can help to clear away some of the obstacles that are there. It's certainly a cooperative thing, creating a relationship between ourselves and enlightened mind, enlightened energy, enlightened activity is critically important, because it does support our practice, and it will serve as a source of inspiration, of blessings, and it can, help to, people can have dreams of certain things once they make that connection that can kind of help. There's a tradition of doing what's called mo or divination, where if you have that connection, then you can get some signs in various ways about, like, should I do this? Should I do that? What the right kind of thing to do is. And then, of course, through our teachers, we also look at, to see them as a conduit as well for receiving guidance and benefit. So definitely it plays an important role. I don't know if I can say anything more than that. Okay, so to go back to this idea of the Four Noble Truths, right, so I said I described what an Arya being is. So the Four Noble Truths, then, they're not four ideas that are noble. They are four things that are known to be true by beings who are Arya beings. When an Arya being looks at the world, they see the world as being true in these four ways, or that they understand that these four things are true about the world. And what's important is that we're not Arya beings, and so we don't see the world this way. We kind of have our own version of the Four Noble Truths, or we see the world in four ways, but they're kind of at odds with how Arya beings see it. And that's the kind of difficulty, is that we lack this particular insight. And so we're looking at the same world, but we have our own way of approaching these four concepts as an ordinary being. So that's kind of what we will start to look at now, and we'll continue next week as we pick it back up. So the Four Noble Truths, when we look at this, we can think of an analogy which is sort of a medical analogy that they use. So, because we probably know the Four Noble Truths in terms of just the words, the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. Or another way of phrasing it is true suffering, true origins, true cessation, and true paths. Rather than the truth of, a more direct way is to say true suffering, true cessation, or true origins, true cessation, and true paths. So we, as ordinary beings, we're also looking at the world, and we also agree that there is suffering. We look at our own experience, and we look at the experience of others, and we also recognize that suffering exists. The problem, though, is that our understanding of suffering is different than the experience that an Arya being has of suffering, or how they understand suffering. And similarly, we also think that we can identify the cause of suffering, but how we would identify that is also different. And as we continue, it's also true that we might think that, at least in some ways, in certain kinds of suffering, can be ceased, but the way that we think about that is also different, and therefore the method that we use to accomplish that is different. So the problem is that we have our own way of doing all of this, and the Arya beings are saying, well, you kind of understand some of it, but really you don't understand it in its breadth and its depth and what to really do. And that's the difference, is that the Arya being's understanding is much clearer and the methods are more effective. So when I say the medical model, what I mean is, if a person is feeling unwell, you have a headache, you've had a headache for a week, you have a weird pain that you've had for a week or 2 weeks, you then become motivated to do something about it. It's not going away. It seems like a problem. You develop an interest in fixing it. And in order for that to be true, you have to recognize that it is unusual, that something is happening here that needs to be fixed. And so that's true suffering, or the truth of you have to not be in denial. And particularly, you want your doctor, not to be in denial. It is, you yourself might be motivated, but ultimately then you want to go to someone who you identify as being capable of helping you, and you want them to agree, yeah, something's going on here. This isn't normal. You're not hallucinating. You're not making this up. Like, I agree with you that there's something really wrong here. If none of those things are happening, then there's no possibility of solving this issue. But then the second thing that you want to happen is that this doctor can pinpoint what's going on. They can tell you, okay, I ran a test, we did an MRI, I drew blood, whatever it is, and then they can give you a specific diagnosis. They can say, this thing that you're experiencing, it's because you have this condition, or you have this virus, or it's this bacteria that is the root cause of your symptoms. If they can't do that, still you're pretty stuck. They're just kind of, and you hear examples of that. People go from doctor to doctor to doctor, nobody can figure it out, and they're stuck with the symptoms because there's no diagnosis. So hopefully you would want a diagnosis. You'd want the origin of your suffering to be pointed out. But still, that's not enough. You're kind of moving in the right direction. People will say, oh, now I have a diagnosis. Great. Maybe now I can be more productive about what's happening. But then that means you also want your doctor to tell you that it's fixable, that I've seen other people with this condition, I've read about this condition, I know that people have recovered. But even that, so that would be true cessation, meaning that this doctor is very, very confident that what you're experiencing isn't intractable. It's not kind of just baked into your being. It's fixable. Still, though, even there, that's not enough, because you would want them to actually be able to give you a treatment plan. You would want them to say, this is the medication, this is the surgery, this is what we're going to do that will lead to your being well again, to you being fixed, to this disease, this condition being eliminated from your body. And that would be a true path, a true method of leading to the cessation of suffering, of your suffering. So this is what the Buddha's first teaching was on. Um, was on Here the word that's translated into English as suffering is the word dukkha, Dukkha, dukkha. And the word dukkha that we're translating into English as suffering, again, is one of these examples of not such a great translation, because it seems like there's many Tibetan words that have a really nuanced meaning that our language just kind of doesn't have. Because dukkha has this, because when we think of the word suffering, we think of only, a headache, cancer, some sort of overt physical or mental distress. We think of that as suffering. And dukkha has an element of unsatisfactoriness to it. When the Buddha is saying that all of our experiences are in the nature of dukkha, or characterized or marked by dukkha, it isn't to say that everything is overtly physically or mentally distressful. That's not true. But everything that we experience as an ordinary sentient being is characterized by a sense that it's not fully satisfactory, that it's not perfect peace, that it's not a complete, that there's agitation in the mind. There's a sense that things are not quite right, that it's not as good or as peaceful or as tranquil, or as perfect as it could be, that the mind is always a bit agitated. And that is true about, when we think of our experiences, that is kind of our baseline state, that we're always kind of trying to fix this sort of baseline sense of unease that tends to permeate things. So it's a deeper way of understanding suffering than just physical or mental distress. And it is true of all sentient beings all of the time, that the mind is never perfectly at ease. The mind and the body, our bodies are, even just sitting for a while, you get little aches, little pains. The body is never perfectly at ease, at peace, quiescent, joyful. There's always some discomfort in the body and mind. So that the Buddha is asserting that is true about our ordinary experience. And that's a bummer. That's the First Noble Truth is depressing. But it does get better, from there. Just like the first, if you're feeling well and then you start to feel unwell, that's upsetting and kind of, it's not great. But you're noticing suffering. And from the Buddhist perspective, we have to really understand suffering to very subtle and very deep levels, rather than just having a surface level understanding of it, so that we excise it in a very deep way and we're not satisfied with temporary surface level approaches to fixing it. Which is why we need, in the same way, doctors study disease, not because disease is the point, wellness is the point, but you can only get to wellness if you become an expert in disease and the treatment of disease. So we need to face suffering and confront suffering so that we are actually motivated to remove it, even in its subtlest form, and not just be content with a very surface level understanding. But the second noble truth, things start to move in a more positive direction, where the Buddha says, okay, um, this is true about this is our existential condition, but we can understand the origin of this. Um, and that is something that we'll look at in more detail as we go through. Well, I mean, we're going to be looking at all of this in more detail because the Four Noble Truths is kind of the blueprint of all of the Buddhist teachings. Everything else that the Buddha taught really is a further explication of one or more of the Four Noble Truths. So, but it's sort of, so it's the foundation that we will expand upon throughout the course. But the second noble truth, the Buddha says that it isn't the case that we have to be experiencing this. It isn't the case that this is unavoidable, that this is traceable back to what are called the afflicted states, the kleshas, the afflictions, as I mentioned, things like hatred, jealousy, and so on, the states of mind that are agitating, that we, because there's a very, very complicated way of understanding how that relates to the actions that we engage in, how those actions have an energy that kind of gets laid down in the mind, and how that interacts with external reality to create experiences. So it gets very, very complicated. But essentially, if there are afflictions in the mind, then we will experience reality as having a dissatisfactory nature or aspect to it. If we remove the afflictions from the mind, we will not experience reality as having this unsatisfactory quality. It's like you have glasses on that have a filter, and so everything that you experience, you think has that color or that, and it doesn't. Your glasses are doing that to you. You take the glasses off, and now reality appears differently to the same reality, same person, but the filter has been removed. So we don't actually have to change anything about reality, and we don't really have to change anything about our mind. We just have to get rid of what's being layered on top of our mind that's causing us to misunderstand the nature of reality, to misinterpret what we're experiencing, to see it in a different way. So that starts to get better. Now it's not baked into being, to existing, and it's not out there. It's not baked into the world. It is something that we are experiencing, but that it's at least identifiable in that way. And then it gets better because on the third noble truth, the Buddha asserts that it can be completely removed, that it isn't only that we know why it's happening, but now the Buddha asserts that there is a true cessation. It is possible to do that work and to remove that filter from the mind. And then the fourth noble truth is even more exciting because he says, and I can give you the methods, I can give you the path that you yourself can follow that will lead you to that cessation, that will bring about the removal of that filter from your own mind. So Buddhism kind of gets a bad rap, in talking about suffering, and kind of seems people think of it as sort of depressing to think about. But that's kind of like saying that we should just pretend that, physical illness isn't a thing that exists, and that we don't need to eat healthy, we don't need to exercise, we don't need to take care of the body, because illness is a made up thing that we shouldn't think about and unfortunately our culture kind of is like that. Our culture is so obsessed with youth and vitality. We kind of do sweep those things, but we see the consequences of that in our world. We see avoidable disease, and we see treatable things because people aren't kind of doing the things that they need to do that would help them to be healthier. um, so the Buddha is just saying, this is treatable. You can do these things and you can get this result, and then you can be kind of the perfect, healthiest, most complete, most unified being that reality permits. Because these teachings were not revealed to the Buddha by a creator. There isn't a creator in Buddhism. The Buddha just uncovered this path, these methods, and then he explained them to other people. And luckily, even though 2,600 years have passed, it's still a living, vibrant, understood tradition in our world that we can benefit from. And if we choose, we can also follow in the footsteps of the Buddha and get that same result that the Buddha got, just by replicating the insights that he had. Um, So it's not a depressing, religion in that it's, obsessed with suffering. As I said, it is important to not stop at a superficial understanding of suffering, because if we do that, we will only be able to apply superficial antidotes to suffering. We do have to understand suffering in all of its complexity and to its depth. But the purpose of that is to remove it completely, even in its subtlest manifestations, to be utterly and completely free of it, which is what the Buddha is asserting is possible for us, that we don't have to accept suffering, we don't have to accept these unsatisfactory conditions. We can completely eliminate that from the mind. And then all that the Buddha did was then further explain how to understand suffering, how to understand its origin, how to understand its cessation, and how to understand the path that reliably leads to its cessation. Everything else that he taught was just how to actually make that happen, because he himself did it, and he just is now telling us, this is how you do what I've done. Okay, let me pause again. Any thoughts or question? Yeah, I mean, so attachment, yeah, like I said, we can't describe reality itself as being in the nature of suffering. Suffering arises when you relate inappropriately or poorly to reality, when you relate to reality through the lens of attachment and aversion and hatred. Um, Misidentification. So we'll get to um, it. It takes about an hour to kind of in any way talk about the nature of reality. Um, so that's kind of the very last class, where we will get a little bit. We'll touch on um, the nature of reality and how we misknow the nature of reality, and how that subsequently gives rise to attachment and hatred and jealousy and all of these secondary and tertiary and so on afflictions. So misidentification is maybe an okay way of thinking about that. It's an active misknowing about, because it isn't, of the root delusions, there's what's called fundamental ignorance, which gives rise to even the other root delusions and gives rise to the secondary and so on delusions. And ignorance, again, not a great word, because we usually think of ignorance as a lack of knowledge. And Buddhism says that we actually actively misknow things. We're not just ignorant of the nature of reality. We think that we are clearly seeing reality, and we are wrong. So we're actively misknowing everything that we experience. That's kind of, but we'll have to give, we'll kind of have to devote like a whole hour and a half to kind of unpacking that. And that happens in the 5th class. Any other thoughts or questions? Identification with materialism. Yeah. Yeah. So material, in a way, materialism. Again, I don't have time to kind of creating a state of disconnection. No, so what I mean is that it just, in order for me to describe it in a way where I think people won't misunderstand what I'm saying, I have to talk for an hour straight, is all I mean, in order for me to explain it in a way where I think I cannot give rise to misunderstanding. Um, so, um, so I just have to give it its own space and time to do that. But in a way, yeah, so it refers to when we cognize anything that can be cognized, we give that act of cognition kind of a solidity, kind of like materialism, like you're saying. We think that we perceive accurately, but we give a status and a solidity to what we observe that it doesn't actually have. We think that how we perceive doesn't need to be reflected on because it's accurate. And the Buddha says, no, when we perceive, we, the act of perception itself gives things a sense of separation and a sense of otherness and a sense of identity separate from oneself that actually isn't valid about what we're perceiving. So that hopefully that will become more clear, in the last class. It's hard to make it clear without spending a lot of time going through kind of point by point. Any questions? We're just about out of time. But if there's any final, oh, of course, no problem. All right, I guess we'll leave it there for today. Is it made more clear by meditation? So Meditation plays an invaluable role in the process, but also study plays a really important role in the process. Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, gives a really important role to, because as I said, when we meditate on something, we have to have some clarity in the mind to know what we're meditating on, so that we, even, and this is true of anything, if we're trying to meditate on impermanence, as an example, the word impermanent, again, there's so many, countless examples of words that have insufficient meaning in English. We think of the word impermanent as just thinking of, oh, this is temporary. Oh, this is, this table, in 1,000 years, this table won't exist. And so the table is temporary. But impermanent means that which changes moment by moment by moment, that which is never the same in any two moments in the continuity of the object. And if we don't understand that intellectually, even if we try to meditate on impermanence, we might just be trying to familiarize ourselves with a coarser, less sophisticated way of thinking. And the Buddha doesn't want us to do that. He wants us to really get at a deeper level of things. So study plays a really critical role in all of these realizations that I've been alluding to. And what we'll see, we'll get to a point in this course where we use, if you want to look at it, the Foundation of All Good Qualities, which is a text by Lama Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelug tradition that I said our center is based in. The Foundation of All Good Qualities is a very short, 1-page, 2-page, sort of what's called a lamrim prayer, where there's maybe 14, 15 stanzas, where each stanza is presenting an important topic on what's called the lamrim, or the stages of the path to enlightenment. And this is where you do this study. It's in the lamrim, essentially, which was a later, and again, we'll get into that in more detail. We're actually going to go through the lamrim briefly, very, very briefly. But people spend their whole lives studying the lamrim. There's a class on it here on Mondays and Thursdays from 5:30 to 6:30. The past classes on that are on the YouTube channel, where we're kind of trying to look at that in some detail. So we start out by using study to have a clear intellectual understanding. And now we're ready to meditate, really, at that point, where we single-pointedly try to focus the mind on what we have understood. But we want to use study to make sure we're actually having the insights that the Buddha had, and not a coarser level of insight. Without meditation, though, enlightenment is impossible. That's true. If we don't meditate, we will not achieve enlightenment. That's true. At least as presented in our tradition, there's no method. Maybe for incredibly special beings, they are so ready based on, but probably they meditated in previous lives. So for us, meditation as a vehicle is unavoidable. Yep. All right. We will pick it up next week then. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
you.
Have a great night. And we'll see you next week.